Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sake Revolution. This is America's first sake podcast. I am your host, John Puma from the Sake Notes, also the administrator at the Internet Sake Discord, and the guy on the show who's not a sake samurai.
And I am your host, Timothy Sullivan. I am the Sake Samurai. I'm also a sake educator, as well as the founder of the Urban Sake website. And every week, John and I will be tasting and chatting about all things sake, and doing our best to make it fun and easy to understand.
That's right, Tim. And what is in store for us this week? I understand you brought somebody along.
Yes, we have a VIP guest in the studio with us today, the virtual studio. I want to welcome Monica Samuels, who's the director of Sake and Spirits for Vine Connections. Monica, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. This is so much fun.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Monica, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit of a self-introduction?
Sure. Well, as Tim said, I work for a company called Vine Connections. I manage their Japanese side of the portfolio. We represent 17 sake producers throughout Japan and a couple of distillers of whiskey and gin and shochu. I have been in the sake industry for about 13 years, working on the restaurant side, distributor side, and now the import side. So it's something that's extremely important to me. I'm half Japanese, so I was lucky enough to speak Japanese growing up and spend a lot of time in Japan as a child. So it was something that felt really natural to me. I live in New York City. I'm originally from Southern California, and I drink a lot of sake.
You mentioned you worked in restaurants and things like that. How did you actually get started? What were your first steps into the sake industry?
Well, I always really I had a really strong passion for hospitality and food and beverage. And I was going to school studying marketing with the understanding that working in a restaurant my whole career was probably not sustainable. But it was something that always attracted me much more than anything else. And eventually inspired me to move to New York. I followed my older sister, who had moved there a few years before me. And the first weekday that I'd lived in New York, I kind of stumbled into this restaurant, Sushi Samba, and they were hiring a server, and had nothing going on in my life. And they were really short-staffed. So I ended up working like 80 hours a week, and I was picking up all kinds of extra responsibilities. And so I grew very quickly in that company because it was just being in the right place at the right time. I became the general manager of the location in the West Village that I was working at in a couple of years. And I moved to Chicago and opened a location there for them. And being Japanese and someone who's very multicultural, and it's a very multicultural restaurant, I became the mascot for Sushi Samba, and they really liked having me represent the company. And we had a very large sake list for that time. It was 2004, 2005, and we had 100 sakes on the list. So that was what we were always noted for. And we had a really very active PR team. And so I ended up being the spokesperson talking about our sake list more and more. And eventually I took over the beverage program for all of their locations around the country. And it gave me the inspiration to start studying really hard and taking the category very seriously.
That's very interesting. Nice. You mentioned that that's how you got started in the restauranting end of things, but I'm very curious as to what was your introduction to sake itself? What was your sake aha moment when you kind of really discovered the beverage?
Well, so my parents don't drink. And so I think most people growing up are able to pinch a little bit of this and that from the liquor cabinet and from the fridge. And that's your first experience with sake. And I did not have that opportunity because my parents didn't drink alcohol. And I spent summers at my grandparents' house in Tokyo. And my grandfather, when he was discharged from World War II, a sake brewery was the only company who really was interested in hiring him. So he had actually worked as a kurabito in a brewery in Ibaraki that is no longer in operations. And so I always knew that my grandfather liked to drink sake and knew a lot about it. And there was always sake open, and it was not transportive sake. It was usually a niche domain of Futsushu that was very inexpensive, but nobody ever noticed if the level in the bottle got lower. So, so that was the first alcohol that I'd ever drank. And, Japanese people are really, really humble, and they're very awkward about promoting themselves and kind of being their own cheerleader. And so being a loud, boisterous American, it was like I saw this opportunity to really promote people who weren't able to do it themselves. And it was probably working at Sushi Samba that I had my first great glass of sake. Like I usually choked it down as a teenager in Japan, but it was really working in New York that I had my first introduction to great sake.
Yeah, that hearing about Sushi Samba around that time really makes me think of like Sex and the City and that whole like cocktail culture and emerging sake culture. It must have been a very heady, like exciting time to work there.
It was, and I have to give the owners a lot of credit. We would create these nightlife experiences and kind of force people to drink sake. All the cocktails had sake in them, and
That's
people definitely did not go there to drink sake, but they inevitably ended up drinking sake. And we would overbook the restaurant to the point where people were waiting hours for their table, and we always gave them complimentary sake. And one way or another, if you went to Sushi Samba, you ended up drinking some sake.
That's awesome. Now, that was kind of your first step into your professional work life. And obviously, you connected really well with sake, and here we are. But what attracted you to sake to work with it professionally going on even after you left Sushi Samba? Like, why didn't you go on to some other thing? Like, what kept you with sake? What was the attraction there?
I think it was how welcoming brewers in Japan were.
Yeah,
I found the category much easier to get my head around than wine. The world of wine is so massive, and there's so much studying of maps, and you go 10 kilometers and the grape is called something else. And I just found that to be really exhausting. And sake, I think if you study it for a little while, you feel really empowered, like you really have the nuts and bolts down. So that was great. It gave me a lot of confidence in my ability to communicate about sake and to educate others. And then the times that I was able to go to Japan, we had a lot of importers and distributors at Sushi Samba that were very generous. And when I did go to Japan to visit family, they would always set up different brewery visits. And those people were so appreciative and so shocked that I would even be interested in spending time in a brewery. And so it was really charming and really made me feel like the sky was the limit in terms of getting more people into the category.
When you mentioned visiting Japan, and when you've got some time to yourself, that's not you're not bogged down with business. What does Monica like to do in Japan?
I love to go by myself to drink sake. I spend a lot of time in Japan hosting groups, and you know how it is when you're just trying to make sure everyone has a good time, but at the same time you really want everyone to shut up because you're on a train and it's obnoxious that everyone's talking, and you don't want to be the hall monitor who's always like squashing the fun, but you're looking at people doing irreverent things with their chopsticks and shouting and speaking Japanese, like trying to speak Japanese in a way that almost sounds like they're mocking Japanese people. And everyone's always late for the bullet train in the morning, and it's so stressful. And so as soon as I have a minute to myself, I really like the friends that I have in Japan. I should reach out to them more, but there's something so wonderful about being alone in Japan and just walking into a bar and sitting at the counter, and it's my favorite thing.
I can relate to that.
yeah. Me too.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So speaking about sake in general, whether it's in Japan or here, what everybody has, John and I talk a lot about this on the show. Like we have our types, we have our personal styles of sake that we like, divorced from our jobs or what we sell. But what are some of your personal favorite styles of sake? And in addition to that, some of your favorite food pairings that you really like personally?
So that's an interesting question, right? Because as sake nerds, I feel like we're always reaching for something that's a little more challenging rather than something that's just purely delicious. And for example, there's such a trend right now of these really like tart, high acid, not aged namas and like aged kimoto nama genshu. And I'm really trying to get into that because it's so new, it's so different from the sakes that I cut my teeth on. But are those ones that I drink a whole bottle of before I even know it? No. So I would say that I tend to gravitate towards sakes where the bottle's gone before I realize it. So I don't love, I mean, I can appreciate and respect really, really perfumed ginjo styles or these really like funky, tart, acidic styles, but I do tend to really appreciate balance and restraint in sakes. I actually drink a lot of hanjozo. The more I work in spirits, the more of an appreciation I have for blending and the art of blending alcohol where you don't taste it and it's incredibly balanced and it does what it's supposed to do in terms of the style of hanjozo is really resonates with me.
And what about some food pairings with that honjozo?
Um, so I have been on this sake and junk food crusade lately because
I need
Tell
to
me
I need to
more.
know
Tell me
about
more.
this.
well, I mean, we're all drinking more at home. And I think one of the big problems with getting people to drink sake is they think it has to be so precious and they have to have this really exquisite Japanese pairing and the right glassware. And wine is really hard to pair with junk food. And, you know, if you took like almost every sake goes with Pringles, right? Or, and then you can take it a step further and Cheez-its are great with sake. And, you know, and like Doritos, I was eating a onigiri earlier this summer and I had a bag of Doritos because I was in Central Park and we had all kind of brought a mishmash. And out of the Dorito dust, I was dipping the onigiri in the Dorito dust and I was like, this is just like furikake, you know? And so it's like, so I just started thinking more and more about like artificial junk food and how it really is the ghetto version of a lot of like umami and Japanese flavors. So that's definitely my thing right now.
That sounds amazing.
I have a new goal.
I love that. Yeah. Love that.
Yeah. Monica, can you introduce us to the sake that you brought along for us this week?
Yeah, absolutely. So this sake brewery is Manatsuru, and this series of their sakes that they make is called Mana 1751. The brewery was established in 1751, and they're in Fukui prefecture in Ono City. This is the smallest producer that we represent. They make 200 koku. But they make 21 different types of sake. So it's absurd how small production they are. When I visited this brewery, I felt like I was in a diorama of a sake brewery. Like I couldn't believe that these tiny tanks weren't just for show. And it's a one-man operation. And Ono City is really cool. It's kind of like Saijo in Hiroshima, where there's like one street that's a sake brewery street where you can walk to 6 breweries and check them all out. Their
love that.
NHK does this thing where they have these competitions for the best drinking water in Japan every year, and Ono City always is in like the top 5. So they always joke about how hedonistic it is to have the best tasting drinking water in Japan and use it to hose down tanks. And so the water is really great. I'm sure you've heard the story so many times before, but this is one of those producers where when this generation took over the brewery, they really scaled back production. And so they were making 5,000 koku and he really scaled it back. And this guy is pretty cocky. He would go around telling everyone that he wanted to challenge almost all the finishing steps to making sake. So he was very determined to have this iconoclast idea where there's no tank blending. Everything he makes is Yamahai or Kimoto, no added lactic acid, no water dilution. So everything is Genshu, Muroka, no charcoal fining. And of course, everything is Junmmai. He wouldn't dream of adding alcohol. And so I think he ruffled some feathers when he took over, but his sakes are really unique. And he's always saying he's not trying to compete with anyone else's sakes. He's just trying to really create his own identity. And I think I wanted to taste it because it's interesting how there's this overlap between how umami expresses itself in sake and how age expresses itself in sake. And this is super umami rich, but doesn't have any aging. And so I think it's kind of a fun one to taste. And it's very, very lactic, and I always like to think about how that lactic acid expresses itself in the sake. And there's so many different expressions here.
Yeah. And you're talking about the president, Mr. Keisuke Izumi, but he's also the Toji as well as the president. So he's the master brewer and owns the company, which is pretty rare. That's not a common setup.
Yeah. I mean, with 200 koku, there's not a lot of money there to have two people in executive roles. So he's a total obsessive control freak. His son helps out quite a bit, but other than that, it's just him.
So let me define what a koku is for our listeners. That's 1,800 liters of sake is one koku, and it's a measurement by which breweries measure their output of sake. And you said that this brewery makes 200 koku total.
Yes.
Wow, that is exceedingly small. Just for comparison, a medium-sized brewery is going to make about 5,000, and a very large brewery can make 35,000 or more. So 200 koku is a true microbrewery, like no joke.
Wow.
We all have a bottle of the sake that Monica introduced to us, and I'm just going to run down the stats here so that all our listeners can have a quick idea of what we're drinking. So this is a Junmmai. It's also a Yamahai Muroka Genshu, as Monica explained. The alcohol percentage is 16.5. The sake rice is Gohyaku Mangoku, which I understand is grown locally. And the rice milling rate for that Gohyaku Mangoku sake rice is 60%. And the SMV, the measurement of how sweet or dry, is plus 3.5.
So a little bit on the dryer.
All right, and now I'm going to pour into the glass.
It's a beautiful color. It's interesting. He said something a little cocky, I guess, to me about, the color, even though it's Muroka, the color is so pale. And I've heard this from different breweries, but it does seem that the content of bronze in the water is really what gives the most color to the sake. And so there's just not bronze in this water. Like if you go to Saijo in Hiroshima, there's a lot of bronze in the water there. And so Muroka sakes there are quite pronounced, where this is pretty pale.
Yeah, but when you pour it in the glass, you do get a very light straw color. Like there's a noticeable color here versus a charcoal filtered sake for sure. All right. Well, as we always do, let's give it a smell. Okay, now for me, Monica, there's a very clear like lactic and so that's like dairy and butter, yogurt kind of aromas coming through, and also something a little earthy and mushroomy.
100%. I always say this smells like buttered mushrooms, buttermilk, savory yogurt.
Boom, Tim, you're on it. Boom. Yeah. I'm definitely picking up on that mushroom. There's a note on the nose here that just, in my mind, it just makes me think Yamahai.
When we talked about Yamahai on the show in the past, we mentioned that you can have a more overt Yamahai style or something that's a little bit more nuanced and light. And I think this falls a bit more on the true overt Yamahai expression. Like he's trying to show and declare this is a Yamahai sake. That comes across in the aroma for me.
For sure. I think that Yamahai can add complexity in sakes that are very pretty and elegant, like Yukinobosha Yamahai. I love that sake, but it would be hard to blind taste that one as a Yamahai. This is pretty extreme. Like there's definitely I get a smoked meat quality on the nose too that I really love.
All right, let's give it a taste. You know what's interesting for me is on the aroma and on the palate, the alcohol is so well integrated. It doesn't come across as boozy or, when you have these fuller, more earthy sakes, sometimes the alcohol can be a little bit forward as well, but this is really well integrated. It's got a nice richness. And the umami is like front and center, which is so great. And it pairs really well with the aroma. It's all very cohesive.
Yes,
that's kind of what I take away from it.
Yeah, I think, and we talk about this on the show a lot, how when we experience the aroma and in a really well-balanced sake, we kind of want the taste to reflect that. And I think we're totally getting that here with this. This is like the aroma is giving us a promise of what this is going to taste like. And then when we sip on it, it's like, yes, this is exactly what we anticipated.
Oh, yeah. I love the texture on this one too. It really coats your palate. And even though there's a lot about this sake that is aggressive, the balance is nice, and that palate coating quality gives it the ability to tame intense flavors or in food. I mean, I tried this with kimchi, and I thought it was going to be a disaster. It was just a cabbage kimchi, and it was medium level spicy, and it actually worked together, and the sake really rose to the occasion.
Oh wow. Do you have any junk food recommendations to pair with this?
Well, beef jerky for
All
sure.
right.
Oh, totally. Yes.
There's a cocoa note here. I was thinking a lot about donuts this weekend because I'm doing this event with the people in Portland, Oregon. And so Voodoo Donuts is so famous there. And they have a bacon maple donut that's their famous flavor.
Right.
And I could see something like that going really well together.
Ooh, all right.
That sounds amazing. I'm all for a donut. Now, you mentioned, we talked about the 200 koku, the super small production. Does that present any challenges to you as far as getting supply or getting enough sake? Or I would imagine that might be a little bit of a hurdle to get over as far as getting enough of the sake.
Well, I felt really bad for him during the pandemic because we had almost no retail business with this sake, and retailers weren't interested in introducing new items when they were so understaffed. And so we hadn't ordered from him. We finally were able to order from him again recently, which was great. We don't have it available in all markets. We probably have this in 5 states in the US. And we try to communicate that it's somewhat limited, but he hasn't pushed back on any orders so far. I think he makes very, very small batches of his really geeky stuff. Like he does a white koji sake, does a black koji sake, and those are all very, very tiny. So this would be the one he makes the most of out of the 200 koku, and we haven't hit a point where he's pushing back yet. So fingers crossed.
Well, that's good. That's a very good thing. So this is a Yamahai, and I feel like it's a Yamahai lover's Yamahai. I'm having this chilled. Like I just took this out of my fridge maybe 20 minutes ago. My fridge is at 38 Fahrenheit, so it's probably warmed up to about like 41, 42 at this point. Is this something you'd recommend having room temperature or warmed up?
It's really lovely warm, actually. I'm having mine probably about between 55 and 60 Fahrenheit right now, and I used to be a lot more cautious about warming Genshu sakes because I always felt like they would become boozy. But I think when the umami is this high and the acidity is this high, it actually works.
Yeah, I would think this would be a no-brainer for serving warm.
Yeah.
You can also enhance that rich velvety coating texture as well. I find that gets enhanced a little bit when you gently warm up a sake. And that's one of the great characteristics of this sake that you chose, Monica, is that it does have that coating texture you mentioned. And I think that would be even more emphasized served warm.
Yeah. Monica, what do you think that the sake industry needs to be doing to continue to grow internationally and I guess even domestically in Japan?
Well, I think in America, Americans like when things are simplified for them. And they also like when things are specific. And I used to give my brewers a hard time about this all the time when they came to the US, and I would say, okay, well, can you recommend some food pairings? And they'd say, oh, it will not interfere with any food. And I'm like, okay, well, that's not really giving people any direction whatsoever. So you really need to, I think, marketing sake in the US, it's like, okay, well, if you're having steak, you need to have Yamahai. And even if there's a bunch of Yamahais that don't follow that trend, it's okay just to give someone a very direct directions, because I think as educators and sake evangelists, we do pause a lot when people say, okay, so you're saying that every time I have oysters, I should have ginjo. And you're like, well, not every time. And then people get frustrated. And so I think in America, we need to be very explicit and very, very clear about, if you're having broccoli, you need to have this type of sake. Because there's not much of that kind of guidance. And people are always asking, okay, well, every time I have a Junmmai, is it going to taste like this? And you have to say, well, not really. And so I think you have to just forget about the exception to the rule and give people very direct instructions. And I think, for a long time, people thought that there needed to be a Grey Goose of sake, or, just a brand that was such a household name and premium enough for people to take sake seriously. I don't know how I feel about that anymore. I think that it's good to have a go-to brand that can be a jumping off point. But I think that we need to have these clear, if you're drinking this, reach for this, so that people can think about other opportunities to drink sake. And in Japan, I think that the current business model of selling sake domestically is really challenging for brewers to be profitable, in terms of how little they're allowed to mark up their sakes domestically. And then it gives people sticker shock when they see the pricing overseas. And so I think there needs to be a little more of a balance there, and brewers should be allowed, it should be like the US, where producers are allowed to mark up their products as they see fit, and then they can charge less for overseas exports so that it's a little more equitable. Right now, I don't see a lot of Japanese people excited to drink sake in the US when they see that they can buy it for less than half the price domestically.
I didn't realize that there was a ruling on that, and that's why the markets are so low in Japan. I had no idea.
It's just the way that if you want distribution through a sake retail organization, they have very strict requirements on how low the markups must be.
There's an expectation by the Japanese consumer that sake is going to be at a certain range. And if you try to buck that trend and charge a lot for your sake, Japanese consumers don't really stand for that, right, Monica?
100%.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about for the U.S. market in particular? I know everybody always says we need more education, and we all work in that area. Sometimes I think like, oh, maybe we need a rapper to fall in love with sake and put it on his Instagram. What do you think needs to happen in that regard, in the outskirts of education or culture in general, to bring sake more into the spotlight? What do you think needs to happen? This is the $64,000 question, but I always ask myself this.
Interesting specificity with the rapper question, though.
Well, I think that the rapper thing is not a bad idea, because looking right now at the hard seltzer trend, it's very lifestyle driven, right? And people, yes. The hard seltzer drinker, it's very well defined who that is, even if hard seltzer has no origin. We don't know, there's no association with any country. There's nothing, nobody cares what's in the can. It's just the lifestyle that it promotes of being young and active and on a boat somewhere. And so I think that there needs to be something like that, because we have a lot of the pieces, right? People are infatuated with Japan and Japanese culture. People love eating Japanese food, but that's not doing it. There's a desire for Japanese things, but there's not a lifestyle hook there. So I think a rapper could be an interesting way to get that done. I think someone like Chrissy Teigen, getting behind a sake, that could be great. I think more than an athlete, someone who's a really beloved actor or musician would be great to be a spokesperson for the category.
Yeah, and if you look at what happened with the tequila market as well, that was not as popular in the past, and then a few really high-profile celebrities started promoting their own tequila brands, and then it became this huge sector of the spirits market. So that's a sector I always look to as well for a little bit of inspiration in this area.
And it's interesting too, because tequila is marketed as the only spirit that's not a downer, right? People always think of tequila as giving them energy. There are all these diets that, like the keto diet, that tell you that tequila is better than other alcohols. So it promotes this idea that tequila is going to make you a really fun party animal who's not going to get fat. And everybody, that's a very attractive notion. So I think it all comes back to lifestyle.
If I'm not mistaken, isn't Naomi Osaka involved a little bit in sake these days?
Yes, she is a spokesperson for Soto Sake,
Mm-mm.
which I think is great. Naomi Osaka, she's such a role model for young women. She's such a role model for foreign nationals of Japan who don't necessarily feel like they fit in. I think tennis is bigger outside of the US in terms of how important to the brand that could be, but I think it's definitely a step in the right direction.
And I guess finally, last year has been very rough and very unprecedented in a lot of ways. What do you think about the future of sake kind of going forward as we come out of the pandemic?
Well, I think that the silver lining of the pandemic in terms of sake is that people are drinking a lot more adventurously at home, and people are not relying on so much hand holding when they do step outside their comfort zone. We've been very active in the virtual space with events during the pandemic, and we've had really stodgy country clubs where they've never even ordered sake asking to do a sake tasting, and the turnout's been really good. I'm not sure what the coming back is going to look like, and I think as people promoting sake, we all care so much about the restaurant industry, and the restaurant industry has always been the place where we really entrust the most people the most to take care of our sakes, and be able to communicate properly about them. And so it's going to be interesting now that people know how to eat and drink a little better at home, and the restaurant industry is going to have to struggle so much to be profitable coming back. I do anticipate that there's going to be more of a even split between sake sales in terms of retail and restaurant, because no matter what happens, I think people will be eating and drinking at home more frequently after the
Mm-hmm.
pandemic. And sake could be great for that, because I know few people feel comfortable delivering an answer on how long you can keep a bottle of sake open, but at any rate, it's longer than a bottle of wine, right? And so hopefully we can create a culture of people just having a bottle of sake open in the fridge without thinking of, oh, well, I'm just buying this because we're having sushi tonight. And we can get people to think more adventurously in general.
That's great. And that's
Awesome.
kind of in my journey when I was first getting into sake, that's kind of how it started for me. It was something I had at Japanese restaurants or izakayas, and eventually gotten to the point of thinking of it, as you mentioned, not so preciously, and just being something I can have around the house and not need a special occasion to drink.
Yeah. Monica, thank you so much for joining us. Now, if people want to learn more about your work or about Vine Connections, what's the best way for people to find out about your work?
I'm very responsive to emails, so please feel free to reach out to me anytime via email. It's Monica, Monica, at vineconnections with an S at the end, .com. We also have a fantastic website. Our marketing team is really well versed in sake and has created some great assets there that give you information about the category in general and about our producers. So either of those ways would be excellent.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was such an enlightening conversation. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Same here. I've been an avid listener, so I feel a little nervous to actually be on the podcast, but it's very exciting.
Ooh, all right.
Well, if you're an avid listener, I hope you'll stick around for just one more minute and join us in a kanpai at the end.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I do want to thank all of our listeners so much for tuning in. We really do hope that you're enjoying our show. And if you would like to show your support for Sake Revolution, one way you can really help us would be to take a couple of minutes and leave a written review on Apple Podcasts. It's one of the best ways for us to get the word out about our show.
And if you'd also like, please subscribe to our podcast so that every week when we put out a new episode, it'll magically show up on your device of choice and you can give it a listen and then tell a friend and then have your friend subscribe too.
And as always, if you'd like to learn more about any of the topics or sakes that we talked about in today's episode, be sure to visit our website, sakerevolution.com, for all the detailed show notes.
And if you have a burning sake question that you need answered, we want to hear from you. Please reach out to us. The email address is feedback@sakerevolution.com. So until next time, please remember to keep drinking sake and kanpai.